Good morning. Hey, good morning. I think most of you know me, but for the benefit of our online folks, I'm Paul McLain, Associate Rector of Calvary Episcopal Church, and welcome to Adult Formation. And today is the day we begin formation really for all ages for the fall. And I'd like to open on this weekend when we remember the victims and families of 9/11 and think about the 20th anniversary and think about our future going forward. I think it'd be appropriate to remember one of our beautiful prayers in the back of the prayer book. It's the prayer for the human family. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. And I want to share with you our theme for adult formation this fall is identity, relationships, and the world we live in. And we heard a lot of those in that prayer. Identity is what the Adult Formation Committee asked me to talk about, especially from a biblical perspective. And so we're going to look at a couple of Bible characters that you should be pretty familiar with, Moses and Peter. But we'll see if we can learn a little something new about them or maybe something old. And what we really want to look for is discovering their identity, who they are, and maybe how that helps us know better who we are, not only who we are individually, but who we are as a people, as a church. And I want to open with a passage from Exodus, and you each have a handout there. And Sherry, I've asked you, if you would, to come to the microphone and to read our first passage from Exodus 2, chapter 2, verses 1 through 15. And what I want you to do in these passages is listen for traits of identity that you see especially in Moses, but maybe that you see in the other characters in the story, and then just see how those traits may apply to who you are, or who Calvary is, or who we are coming out of a pandemic. So Sherry, thank you for this.
Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he called the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw 2 Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. And for our online audience too, if you can type in any thoughts that you have on identity of Moses that you see in this story, you heard in this story, or things that that it trigger for you an identity of who you are and who Calvary is. And Robin will share those with us as we report. I thought about doing this by table, but since we're not a huge group, why don't we just try this? And if you would just share, if you would come to the microphone and just share any thoughts that you have. What do you see from that infant narrative of Moses? Who is Moses? Would you feel better if we brought the mic to you? We can do that. Sam can bring the portable mic. Anyone? Anyone have a thought? Let me ask you. Yeah.
I would have thought that Moses would have been protected because the daughter of Pharaoh basically adopted him.
Yeah.
And I guess I just would have thought he would have been more protected.
Yeah. So he was, at least in this story, what we learn about him very early on is that he essentially starts out with two families. One big question about Moses is, what is his identity? Is he Hebrew or is he Egyptian? What do you think? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he's really Hebrew, but yet he's living in a lot of ways as an Egyptian. He's apparently being educated as an Egyptian. His mother presumably is being his nursemaid or maid in secret.
What's a Levite?
A Levite is one of the tribes of Israel that was the priestly tribe. Moses comes from the priestly tribe, and his brother, of course, Aaron, we recognize apparently was a priest prior to Moses. What else? What do you notice about his name? Because I drew him from out of the water. So part of his name really means deliverance, and you can kind of associate that later with the parting of the Red Sea, the deliverance, the Hebrew people being brought out of the water for their deliverance and salvation. So the names kind of have a lot of different important meanings or precursors for what's about to happen.
Do you think Pharaoh knew the name Moses? I mean, that would have kind of a giveaway right there.
Yeah.
Gone out of the water.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, actually, it was Pharaoh's daughter who named him. So maybe Moses, I don't know this, but it may have been more of an Egyptian name than a Hebrew name. But you're right, it is interesting. The last part of the story, when Moses had grown up, what are some traits that you would identify Moses with? How would you identify him? Pat?
Well, I don't know how old he was when he was grown up. We can't even figure it out today.
Yeah.
18, 21. I mean, how old was he?
How old was he when he was grown up?
How old was he? And if he grew up for 19 or 20 years as a Hebrew, of course he was Hebrew. Of course he was going to go out and rebel someday.
Yeah.
But I have no idea how old they thought he was at grown.
Right.
It might have been 5 or 10.
Yeah. Now, obviously, I think he was at least probably in late teens, early 20s is what I would guess, but we really don't know. But he went out to you get the impression that he may have lived a fairly sheltered life, because it says he went out to his people and saw their forced labor, that maybe as a child and as an early teen he wasn't exposed to that. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. So he knew that part of his identity, or who he really was, he knew was Hebrew. And he was moved by that. So we know that Moses, there was something that welled up inside him for these his people. But how does he respond? How does he respond to this Egyptian beating a Hebrew? He killed him. He killed the Egyptian. What's that?
Could that have been one of his relatives, kinship?
The Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. It could be.
That's what I'm
That's a
thinking.
good point, Pat.
It
It
wasn't
could be.
just somebody out there, you know.
Yeah, one of his kinsfolk. So he may have at least known that this person was related to him, perhaps part of the tribe of Levi, or
his
somehow he
brother.
knew that. Yeah,
Who
that's a
knows?
good point. So one of the identities of Moses is killer, murderer. What else does he do? What does he do with the body? He hid it in the sand. So he's covering up his crime. And what happens the next day? Well, he saw two Hebrews fighting. He tries to break up the fight. Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew? And the Hebrew says, what's interesting is, who made you a ruler and judge over us? So it's almost as if the Hebrew man recognizes that this man is not really one of us, but not really one of us. He's still part of the ruling class, but is he really? And do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So what does Moses think? Uh-oh. My sin has been found out, at least by this person. If it's known by him, it's probably known by more. They're on to me. So what does he do? He fled. He ran away. So now another word that we could use for Moses' identity is fugitive. So murderer, cover up, artist, and fugitive. Does that sound like the great prophet of the Old Testament who will lead us out of deliverance?
He's also a foster child.
Also a foster child. Good point. Adopted. There you go. And one of the dramatic things about his story is this dichotomy. Is he Egyptian or is he Hebrew? Do you think he was comfortable in either of those two worlds? I don't think so. I don't think he was comfortable in either place and felt out of place maybe in each one, and really wondered who he really is. Yeah.
It would depend on how long he was there.
Right. Right.
I would think.
Yeah.
If he's 9 or 10 and then he goes in, or who knows? The longer you stay out there, the more you're with your whole family,
Right.
the longer you stay.
Yeah. Yeah. Michael, you have a point?
Stories like the jump ahead that father-in-law, wait a minute, he get married? Come on.
He did.
10 years ahead here, what is it?
Yeah, at the end of when he flees, he winds up marrying, I believe her name was Zipporah, and works in her father's fields. So we'll read that in the next part. But yeah, I think it's interesting to just see this dichotomy play out. Who am I? And I think that plays out for us too. Is who are we? You know, we can look at divisions of how we can see in our society. Women, men, Caucasians, African Americans, Native Americans, Latino Americans. Look at the diversity, Asian Americans, look at the diversity of our city. And who is our identity become? And is there a more common identity that we're all invited to or called to? And Kate?
When I think about this, Moses wouldn't have even survived. He wouldn't have lived if it hadn't been for the Pharaoh and the Egyptians.
Right.
And so then, as an adult, all of a sudden he realizes how cruel they are and takes action against that. And that just must have been a very difficult decision for him to make. He grew up around that, and yet he has to end up fighting it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's something that welled up inside him that maybe I am Hebrew at my core, even though I've been educated and even though the Egyptians are the ones who saved me. And he's probably had everything that he might have wanted as a child, but yet there was something that welled up inside him when this incident happened. Yeah.
They also have some income in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and it makes us think about the refugees from Afghanistan who are coming in. That was announced late this week, that we will be involved with resettling some refugees here in Memphis through the Memphis World Relief and through the city of Memphis are partnering, and they're looking for churches to partner. I know 12 churches have already gotten involved, and I know Christine has inquired about information about this. So it's an opportunity for us to offer welcome to someone who's fleeing from another place, and probably people who are still seeking what is my identity, that I still identify with my homeland, but yet the homeland doesn't seem to have a place for me anymore. Who am I now? And people who are going to be wrestling with that question. Let's take a look at this next passage. This is the burning bush passage. Do I have a volunteer who'd be willing to read this? Ted? And Sam's going to give you the microphone.
As an aside, I saw a cartoon yesterday on the internet. Moses is standing there looking at this damp, smoldering bush as Smokey Bear walks away. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. You want more?
Yes,
Okay. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelis now has come to me. I have also seen how Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people to the Israelites out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I think it's God, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you when you have brought the people out of Egypt. You shall worship God on this mountain.
Okay. And again, looking for traits that you see in Moses in this story, or see in God, or anything else. And Robin, please let us know if we have some online comments that we might want to take in. What do you see in Moses' identity? at the burning bush?
He was curious.
He was curious. Yeah. He was out, what was he out doing? Tending the flock. So we know that he's working. Scared is the big one that I think came up for me, scared.
What really impressed me is that he did it, kick off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground.
Right. He was obedient and reverent. Yeah, he was obedient to at least to this first part of what God was, if we saw a burning bush in a field or near my apartment, I probably would run away from it. I would call Ruthie to handle it.
There's such a contradiction here because here he is raised in the house of Pharaoh, and yet here he is tending the flock.
I know.
So he's very unassuming, he's humble, and it's like, oh my God, why all of a sudden am I in the midst of all of this? I'm being elevated for this certain task.
Yeah.
Just had to be overwhelming for him.
Yeah. Pat?
But was he raised in the house of Pharaoh? I mean, his mother took him to when he was growing up, so here he is.
Yeah.
I think that was kind of
Pharaoh's daughter was paying the way for his nurse.
Yeah.
He was connected somehow or other. He was not just somebody out there putting together mud bricks or stuff. He had some connections with the royal house.
Yeah. Yeah, but he seems to be happy, or we can make the assumption that he seems happy in this life of being away from all that, away from his Egyptian life, away from the Hebrew slaves. He's out in this field, out in a remote area. He's got time in this pasture maybe to figure out who he really is. Michael, do you have a point?
How old do you think he was here? How old was
We don't know unless, I don't know exactly how old he was, but, we think that he had been with his father-in-law for a number of years. I think he had a child, so I think this was years later.
And how old was he when he died, presumably?
Oh, I have forgotten what, something like that. Something like that. But what, in the second part of this, when God tells Moses what God has observed, and that I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt, what is Moses' response?
Who am I to do this?
Yeah, who am I to do this? It's a very reluctant response. And if you read later, we didn't include these verses, but they have a long dialogue, and Moses has several excuses why he's not the one to go. Anyone remember one of the excuses?
He couldn't speak well.
He couldn't speak well. And many people, because of the way that was worded in Hebrew, or because I've made some thoughts about that who perhaps had a stutter. Or, there have been a lot of comparisons drawn between him and those who have a stutter. Whatever you think about President Biden, I think he's brought a greater awareness of people who've had problems with stuttering and has had a real empathy for that. And those of you who are teachers, I know that you've encountered that and probably had a real empathy for it. And you may see a preacher when he gets nervous today at 10:30 do it as well. But yeah, there was something about him that he may have had he at least did not feel confident in his speech. And there may have been a speech impediment, there may have been something else. But those of you who did read further, do you know what God tells him?
His brother will speak for him.
His brother Aaron, who we talked about a moment ago, who's a priest, will speak for him. But do you know what really happens when Moses encounters Pharaoh during the plagues? The first plagues, Aaron does have a more prominent role, but toward the end of the plagues, we don't see Aaron at all. It's Moses. It's amazing how he grows in confidence. I think one of the things this lesson teaches us about identity is God can see something in us that we can't see. And maybe others, especially teachers, parents, but maybe friends or others can see in us gifts that we don't see. I remember sharing the story actually of a speech therapist who was quite an introvert in Lawrence, Kansas, and how the rector at our church said, "Barry, you know what? I think you would make a wonderful volunteer coordinator for our food pantry program." Barry thought, "What? I'm a shy introvert. I just retired as a speech therapist. You want me to recruit volunteers for the food pantry and organize that? I don't think, maybe there's something else I'm called." No, I think this is where your gifts may be. And Barry just took that and ran with it. The Trinity Interfaith Food Pantry grew to, had almost 40 volunteers, just a sensational program. And Barry was having the time of his life. He was still a little shy and reclusive, but he enjoyed getting to know the stories of the volunteers, and it was just amazing how that happened. And I asked the priest, "How did you identify?" He said, "Well, I think I just saw that Barry could do it. And plus, to be honest with you, I just needed someone to be volunteer coordinator for the food pantry." Robin? Oh, the microphone?
Carrington Wise says, Moses seems happy to be by himself with his sheep, not comfortable being asked to go back. Thoughts of being asked there, who made you ruler?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Going back to the Hebrew person who said, "Who made you ruler?" Parts of it, too, is will the people, well, that was one of his other excuses. There's no way the people are going to listen to me, regardless of if my brother speaks for me or not. They're not going to listen to me. And again, God says, yes, they will. And I think God saw something especially in Moses, the fact that maybe he lived in two worlds. Maybe that he understood, felt like that he might have the ability to really confront Pharaoh and that world, a world that he came from. As well as, I think God knew the passion that he felt for the Hebrew people. Obviously, did not approve of him killing to honor that passion, but still saw that there was passion within him and caring for the people. So, yeah.
Moses, the very first one who really had a revelation of Jesus or God here before him on the mountain, and nobody else had ever seen him before then.
That's right, yeah. And one thing that, one of the identities of Moses is here we have a new world that he's living in, encountering God face to face, and he's the only one who's doing that. Robin?
We've just had a request for you to repeat the comments and the questions of people who aren't using the
Oh, I'm
microphone,
sorry.
that are
Sorry.
online people.
Kate was asking if about his appearances, that he was one of the few, commenting, one of the few to actually see or encounter the face of God, one of the earliest figures in the Bible to actually do that. And both in this burning bush episode and later, of course, with the Ten Commandments, it spent what seemed like months or maybe years in the presence of God away from the people during their 40 years in the wilderness. So it's another example of how he lived in two worlds. He lived in this world of being the one to be face to face with God, but yet being the one to lead and interact with the people. And he had to navigate those two worlds too, of people that were often resistant to what God was wanting them to do or telling them to do. So we learn a lot about his identity, about living in, and I think we can see ourselves, we live in different worlds. Sometimes we can separate our work life from our family life, from our church life, from our other lives. We compartmentalize our lives. And yet, I think we're happiest when all that is integrated, when we feel that all that is one. And, and I think as Ruthie was pointing out, part of what we can learn from Moses' story is how to be sensitive to the fact that there are people of other races, other cultures, other around us, the Afghan refugees coming in, but there are lots of others. How do we offer hospitality? How do we be welcoming? How do we learn to live in their world and understand that there are different worlds that they may be missing right now? And how do we bring a little bit of that to them and welcome them into this world and try to incorporate, what their culture is, what they're longing for into their world? They're not easy questions, but I think his story invites us to do that. Well, let's look at. I also wanted us to look at Peter from the New Testament. And I'd like to invite, is there anyone who would read Matthew 16, 13 through 20? Have a volunteer? Okay, thank you. And if you'll bring the mic to Jenny.
Is it Caesarea Philippi?
Caesarea Philippi.
Okay. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah.
Okay. When you look at Peter in this story, what do you see? Michael?
A really confused person. I mean, he goes one way, he goes the next way, and then he ends up denying Jesus 3 times.
Right. We're going to talk about the denial in just a minute. But in this part of the story, for him to say, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God," I think that's the first time anyone's addressed Jesus that way. What does that say to you about Peter?
He's very perceptive.
Very perceptive?
Perhaps Jesus had already chosen him, giving him that kind of knowledge and insight.
Perhaps. Yeah.
He was always jumping out of the boat.
He was jumping out of the boat. There's a boldness about Peter. For him to assert that publicly, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." You'll notice in our Mark text, it's very different today. This episode of what we experience in Matthew, where Jesus blesses Peter, or Simon, son of Jonah, blesses him, and says, What does he call Peter in this passage? The rock. And, we think of Peter and we see him, as Michael was just saying, kind of vacillating a lot of times, moving from one thing to another. But yet Jesus sees in Peter, it's kind of like what God saw something in Moses that Moses didn't see. Jesus is seeing something in Peter that Peter may not fully see. That this is the rock on which he will build what? His church. And this is one of the few times the word church appears in any of the Gospels. I think it only appears in the Gospel of Matthew. And what will he give Peter? Keys of the kingdom of heaven. And if you ever go to churches, the Washington National Cathedral, for instance, is really, I think their official name is the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul. And one of their symbols is keys. In any church usually that bears the name St. Peter, you will often see a stained glass window or a little symbol somewhere with keys in it. What do the keys signify? Answers? In what way?
Answers to the questions about the religion.
Yeah. Okay.
Entrance or locking, right?
Yeah. Right. Entrance, we think of St. Peter as the one at the pearly gates, at the entrance. And I think many of us have been led to a different view of heaven than that. But we think of Peter as being given the keys. It said, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That Peter could have a role in judgment. So it's really, he's imparting a lot to Peter. But I wish we included the verses that we are going to hear today in Mark. when Peter takes Jesus aside and rebukes him, when he learns that Jesus says the type of Messiah, the type of the Son of God, Son of Man he will be, is one that will suffer, be rejected, and be killed. And Peter rebukes him. What does Jesus say to Peter?
He curses him.
Yeah. Well, he says, "Get behind me," what? Yeah. Yeah, he compares Jesus to Satan. You know, and while we think of Satan immediately as the devil, I was reading one Jewish commentator who's looking at this passage who said, you know, Satan is also, there is that connotation, and that connotation was beginning to appear at the time of Mark, but a real Jewish connotation is Satan is seen as the adversary, the prosecuting attorney, the looking at the other side of the question. So that may give you a different vantage point, but regardless, Jesus chastises Peter for being focused too much on human things and not on divine things. So we are, yeah, and I think Peter brings that about. I think one of the great things about Peter is the humanity. And one thing, too, in looking at the stories of Peter, what's interesting in the Bible is that we get so many accounts that are honest accounts of Peter's mistakes, his foibles. And around ancient writing, sometimes the writers would try to create a story. In other words, they would not refer to many of the foibles. Well, we seem to get all of them in Peter's case. And this author asserts, actually, it's Adam Hamilton who wrote a new book on Simon Peter. He's a pastor of Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City and did a lot of research on Peter. And he said, you know, his theory is that the reason we hear so much about the foibles of Peter is he talked openly about them throughout his story. He acknowledged that was a part of who he was, who he is. Pat?
Wasn't there a lot of competition going on with all the disciples wanted to be first?
Yeah. Pat's saying there was a lot of competition among the followers, that all of the disciples wanted to be first. And the Gospel of Matthew especially shows this preeminence of Peter. You've got to wonder if he kind of experienced what Moses may have experienced too, some jealousy from others, you know, and how that affected Peter because of his seeming preeminence among the disciples. We obviously hear that here. We didn't hear of any of them being given the keys or being called the rock. Well, let's look at the next passage. Michael has just alluded to that. Will someone read Matthew 26, 69 through 75? Jan? Sam, if you'll bring the mic to her.
Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to curse and swore an oath, "I do not know the man." At that moment the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
Okay. What do you see in Peter in this story? Fear? Guilt? Yeah, he felt very remorseful at the end.
It seemed like he was in survival when he went out and brought well.
Yeah. Ruthie was saying he was in survival mode.
And what would have happened had he not lived?
Yeah.
Had he not denied Christ 3 times?
Yeah. Yeah, and the question is, would he, if he was he was maybe trying to survive, and would he have died for admitting that he was a follower? That's a fair question. Yeah, there's fear. And again, I think what's interesting too is in the passage of John, when the resurrected Jesus appears to Peter, he asks him, Peter, do you love me? How many times did he ask him that? 3 times. And how does Peter respond? Yes, I love you. You know that I love you. And what does Jesus tell him to do? Feed my sheep. And so it's interesting that we have the denial 3 times, and then in this other passage we have this questioning 3 times where Peter's, a lot of ways it's almost like he's given a second chance. And maybe that's part of our identity too with God, is that we will enter survival mode sometimes. We will make decisions that maybe not be the most godly decisions that we could have made, but maybe not. Maybe out of survival he needed to do that. Kate?
Well, Jesus obviously knew Peter's weaknesses, and maybe it's kind of an example to us that we aren't all perfect, we're not all strong, but he is giving us the benefit of the doubt. I'll be there when you need me, I'll give you the strength you need to accomplish what I want you to do.
Yeah. That Kate was saying that God will ultimately give Peter the strength and confidence to do what he needs to do. And that's what, I don't know if we have quite time. Well, why don't I read as much as I can of this final passage from the book of Acts. In Caesarea, this is later in Peter's ministry, and again look for identity with Peter. In Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort as it was called. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. One afternoon at about 3 o'clock, he had a vision in which he clearly saw an angel of God coming in and saying to him, "Cornelius." He stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" He answered, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with Simon a tanner, whose house is by the seaside." When the angel who spoke to him had left, he called 2 of his slaves and a devout soldier from the ranks of those who served him, and after telling them everything, he sent them to Joppa. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven opened, and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its 4 corners. In it were all kinds of 4-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Now, while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision that he had seen, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, "I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" They answered, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man, who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say." So when Peter invited them in and gave them lodging, the next day he got up and went with them, and some of the believers from Joppa accompanied him. The following day they came to Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. On Peter's arrival, Cornelius met him and, falling at his feet, worshipped him. But Peter made him get up, saying, "Stand up, I am only a mortal." And as he taught with him, he went in and found that many had assembled, and he said to them, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. Now may I ask why you sent for me?" Cornelius replied, 4 days ago at this very hour, at 3 o'clock, I was praying in my house, when suddenly a man in dazzling clothes stood before me. He said, "Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and ask for Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying in the home of Simon a tanner by the sea. Therefore I sent for you immediately, and you have been kind enough to come. So now all of us are here in the presence of God to listen to all that the Lord has commanded you to say." So what are your impressions of Peter's identity now? He's older. This is post-resurrection. Michael?
He's the most human of the 12, in my opinion.
Yeah.
He's the one that says, "Look, I am only what I am." But he doesn't really say that. He shows that.
Yeah, he's the most human of the 12. I think there's a lot of humanity we see in Peter. But it's interesting when they were bowing down to him, he says, "Stand up. I'm only a mortal." There's a humility, I think, that Peter, that especially we see in his older age, but I think probably was with him throughout his life. There was a certain humility about that. It takes a lot of humility just to follow, to be obedient. Maybe to take some of the criticism that he took throughout his life. Pat?
And that's pretty impressive, given that he became a rock star. They still was able to have that kind of humility.
Yeah, yeah. She's,
He didn't just all of a sudden, "Oh yeah, that's me, I'm doing all this stuff." That's pretty profound.
yeah, yeah. Pat was saying for our online audience that even though Peter became a rock star, another way of being the rock, right? That he still had this humility, and so that says a lot. Jan?
But this is a critical point.
Yes.
Because this is his realization that the gospel belongs to the outside the Jewish community.
Right.
And begins the building of the church in the Gentile world.
Right. Jan said this is a critical point in the life of the church, that the gospel belongs outside the Jewish community, and it's one of the key points in the missionary efforts among the Gentiles. And Peter, this is what is unheard of right now, apparently among a lot of our political leaders. The willingness to change your mind, to publicly change your mind, is phenomenal. Peter came in with the mindset of what toward the Gentiles?
And where is Caesarea Philippi?
So it's on the coast. It's a maritime port where a number of Gentiles would presumably be present. It's very much a big port city, and it was also a leading city of government as well in that region. But yeah, Kate?
I just want to make a comment that by this time he has become very, very trusting. He's spiritual and yet he trusts in the Spirit. When he's commanded to do this, without hesitation, he does it.
Right. Not only does he go to Cornelius, but when Cornelius, when the kind of the ambassadors of the little group from Cornelius comes to see him, what does he do? He takes care of them. He puts them up. He gives them hospitality. That was unheard of in that time. For him to do that, and that just speaks to how this vision, how he was willing to, when he saw that, he was willing to, again, be obedient, but willing to grow and see a growing that he needed to take place in him. Later on, he will kind of revert back, and Paul will rebuke him in the book of Galatians, when they're having a kind of a dinner gathering where Peter goes back to the Jewish table, and Paul publicly rebukes him there. But it was amazing, too, that Peter would later become the spokesperson in front of the Jewish councils to say, we need to accept the Gentile followers, and we don't need to put a lot of oppressive terms on their coming. Said, they are believers like we are. They are part of who we are. I think we're out of time, but I thank you all for being here. We want, again, our kickoff, this is our kickoff for a theme of identity, and we'll continue talking about that along with relationships and the world we live in. Next week, Robin, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Canon Sharon Alexander is here, is that right? Yeah, and I think she's going to be talking about a number of things that Canon Sharon, if you don't know her, has a true heart for immigration. She also has a heart for disaster relief victims. She came here from Louisiana, and she's been keeping us very abreast of the plight of folks from Hurricane Ida who have come here to Memphis or in our general area. And by the way, last Sunday, we had at least one person at 8 o'clock and one person at the 10:30 service who were in town to flee Hurricane Ida. And so it was an opportunity for us to be a little part of their journey. So hope you'll join us again next week. And great to be back together in person and for the folks online. Okay, thank y'all.